Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me here. My name is David Dylan Thomas, and behind me, hopefully, you can see Laurence, the big metal chicken. I'm showing her to you to make sure that you start asking the question, why is there a big metal chicken behind me right now? And you can feel free to answer that in Slack right now if you like. We are going to be coming back to the big metal chicken. But for now, just ask yourself, why is that here? So my name is David Dylan Thomas. Welcome to Design for Cognitive Bias, using mental shortcuts for good instead of evil. I am the founder and CEO of David Dylan Thomas LLC, where I basically try to get people excited about and give them, solutions for more inclusive design. And I wrote this book, Design for Cognitive Bias. Came out last year. It's available now. And the road to this book began with a podcast I used to do called the Cognitive Bias Podcast. And the road to that podcast actually began with this woman. Her name is Iris Bonnet. And she gave a talk once called Gender Equality by Design. And it's a great talk. You should check it out. It's on YouTube. But one of the points she makes is that a lot of the implicit and racial bias we see in the world comes back to sometimes just basic pattern recognition. So imagine that you're hiring a web developer, and the image that might pop into your head when I say the word web developer might be skinny white guy. And it's not because you actually think that men are better at programming than women. Far from it. But the image that the pattern that you've seen over time in movies, in television, maybe in offices you've been in, sort of creates that picture. And so when you see a name at the top of a resume that doesn't quite fit the pattern, all of a sudden you start to give that resume the side eye. So when I saw that something as terrible as racial or gender bias could come back to something as basic and, dare I say, as human as pattern recognition, I decided I need to learn everything I possibly can about cognitive bias. And so I did. This is the Rational Wiki page for cognitive biases. And there's well over 100 here. And I realized I'm not going to figure this all out in a day. So I took one a day and then would move on to the next one. And this turned me into the guy who just wouldn't shut up about cognitive bias. And so my friends told me, Dave, please just get a podcast. Now, it's worth establishing from the jump, what is cognitive bias? And at the end of the day, it's really a series of shortcuts you're making just to get through the day. You have to make something like 1 trillion decisions every single day. Even right now, I'm trying to make decisions about how fast to talk, what to do with my hands, where to look. And if I thought carefully about every single one of those decisions, I'd never get anything done. So it's actually a good thing that a lot of our lives are on autopilot. The problem is, autopilot sometimes gets it wrong. And we call those errors cognitive biases. Now, here's a fun one. It's called illusion of control. And it happens when you're playing a game where you have to roll a die. If you need a really high number, you tend to roll the die really hard. If you need a lower number, you tend to roll it gently. And we all know it makes no difference how hard you roll the die. But in situations where we don't have any control, we like to feel like we have control. And we embody that desire by how hard we roll the die. Now, this next one's not so fun. It's called confirmation bias. And it happens when you have an idea stuck in your head and you really only look for evidence to support that idea. And if you ever see evidence that doesn't support the idea, you yell fake news and you move on. So a powerful example of this came during the lead up to the Iraq War. The whole idea was Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and the coalition of the willing needed to go in there and get him before he got us. Now, as it turns out, not so much with weapons of mass destruction. And within a year, the president of the United States, who had been insisting their weapons of mass destruction, said, yeah, we didn't find anything. So regardless, many people still believed there were weapons of mass destruction. There's so many that even 14 years later, over 50% of Republicans and over 30% of Democrats were like, yeah, absolutely, there were weapons of mass destruction there. So this is an extremely powerful bias, and we will be coming back to it. Now, these biases are very tough to fight. Part of the problem is you may not even realize you have the bias. There's literally a bias blind spot where you think you don't have any biases, but you're sure everybody else does. And part of the problem is about 95% of cognition is happening below the threshold of conscious thought. So you're making these decisions so fast, you don't even realize you've made them. In fact, the next time somebody asks you why you did something, the most honest answer you can give is, how the hell should I know? Even if you know about the bias, you probably still do it anyway. So there's a bias called anchoring. And the way it works is I could ask everybody watching this to write down the last two numbers of their phone number. And then I could say, we are going to go bid on this bottle of wine. Those of you who wrote down lower numbers, probably going to bid lower. Those of you who wrote down higher numbers, probably going to bid higher. It's called anchoring. It's a thing. But here's the thing. I could tell you all of that before we did the experiment. You'd still do it. In fact, I could say, I will give you cash money not to do that. Probably still do it. Now, the good news is there are content and design choices we can make that can help keep some of those biases at bay, or maybe even sometimes use them for good. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. So let's go back to that skinny white guy, right? In experiment after experiment, as it turns out, if you have two identical resumes, and the only difference between the resumes is the name at the top of the resume, if it is a female sounding name, it tends to stay in the pile. If it is a male sounding name, it tends to keep going through the process. But here's the thing. Why do you need that information? What about the name is helping you, the hiring manager, figure out who to hire? Think of it like a signal to noise problem, right? The signal, the thing that's actually helping you make the decision are things like the qualifications, the experience. What might actually be getting in the way are things like gender or race, or really what you're reading into the name in terms of gender and race. Now, the city of Philadelphia did in fact do a round of anonymized hiring for a web developer position. And one of the things they learned is that even in the high-tech world of web development, the most efficient way to actually anonymize a resume is to physically print it out, get a marker, and redact it like a CIA document. The other thing they found out is that as soon as they found a resume they liked, they'd want to go to GitHub, code repository, to try to see the portfolio of that web developer. Problem is, as soon as you get to GitHub, all of the personal information is there and ruins the experiment. So clever people that they wrote a Chrome plugin that would anonymize all that personal data as the page loaded. And then just to complete the circle, they took that code and they put it back on GitHub, and it's there right now if you ever want to try this yourself. A term you want to get familiar with is cognitive fluency. And it is this idea that if something looks like it's going to be easy to read, I'll assume whatever it's talking about, it's probably easy to do. By the same token, if something looks like it's going to be hard to read, I'll assume whatever it's talking about, it's probably hard to do. Now, I have been making a lot of pancakes lately. It's the recipe for pancakes. And the text is kind of small, bunched together. And I might glance at that and think, you know what? I bet pancakes are pretty hard to make. I don't know if I'm going to make pancakes. Now, I could take that same text and give it big, full-width imagery and break it out into more scannable bits of text. And I might take a glance at that and say, you know what? I bet pancakes aren't that hard to make. Maybe I'll make pancakes. A 2-minute video, forget about it. We're making pancakes. Now think about this when it comes to deciding, should I drive or should I take public transportation? If I take one look at that printed schedule, I immediately conclude that public transportation is impossible. I take a look at the app screen there, and I think, you know what? I bet public transportation isn't too bad. Maybe I'll give it a shot. Now, I can't see all of your faces, so I'm going to ask you to vote in your hearts. But how many of you think that Marie Curie was born in 1866? Okay, how many of you think that Marie Curie was born in 1868? Okay, you're both wrong. She was born in 1867. But the point is, people tend to vote for 1868. Reason being, if something is easier to read, we actually think it's more true. But it gets worse. If something rhymes, we actually think it's more true. Now, what's happening here is that we like things that are easy to process. Things that are easier to process feel more certain. I'll give you an example. If I asked you, what did you get for your 5th birthday? You got a toy truck, right? You might not feel too certain about that answer. It's hard to remember. It's hard to process. It doesn't feel very certain. If I said, what'd you have for breakfast this morning? You might feel pretty certain about that answer, right? It's easy to remember. It's easy to process. It feels pretty certain. Things that rhyme are easier to remember, easier to process. They feel more certain. Things that use big, bold fonts and clear imagery and plain language are easier to process. They feel more certain. Now, this becomes important when it comes to things that we need to believe. In America, we have a crisis where African Americans, generally speaking, do not believe health information that comes from the government. In a 2002 survey, when given the statement, the government usually tells the truth about major health issues like HIV/AIDS, only 37% of African American respondents agreed with that statement. If you jump to 2016, that number has dropped to 18%. And if you look at vaccination rates in some black neighborhoods in this country right now, you can see that this is still a problem. So if that, we could do a whole other talk about why there are legit reasons that African Americans have concerns about health information that comes from the government. But the fact remains, this is information that could save lives. So if it needs to rhyme, if it needs to use plain language or pictograms, so be it. Now, when I first put this in the book, my editor very wisely challenged me and said, okay, that's interesting in theory, but can you point to actual instances of cases where plain language and pictograms have helped save lives? And I'm glad she pushed me on it because it forced me to do the work and find these examples. So here you have women who are smoking while pregnant. And when they were given materials written at the 3rd grade reading level, right, easier to process, they found that those women were more likely to quit smoking while pregnant and even 6 weeks postpartum. If you look at people who are caregivers, right, helping other people take their medication, when they had a plain language, pictogram-based intervention, you saw fewer dosing errors and improved adherence to actually taking the medication. Now, you might think, okay, that's fine for plain language and pictograms, but rhyming, really? Let's talk about click it or ticket. Here in the States, a while back, different states rolled out legislation that said if you don't buckle your seatbelt, you can get a ticket. And the legislation on its own did pretty well, but not as much among younger drivers. So they rolled out click it or ticket, and the results were that national belt use among young men and women ages 16 to 24 moved from 65% to 72% and 73% to 80% respectively. Now, just to put that in more human terms, for every percentage point you go up to people actually buckling their seatbelt, about 270 lives are saved. So doing the rough math, that's every percentage point. If you do the rough math, that's about 4,000 lives saved in part through rhyming. Now, the most dangerous bias is print, and it starts out pretty easy. So you go to a store and you see a sign that says beef 95%. So what is the sign that says beef 5%? Faint one way to make it seem more appealing. Now, this is all good and well talking about beef, but what if I were to say, should we go to war in April or should we go to war in May? See what I did there? We're no longer discussing whether or not it's a good idea to go to war in the first place. And wars have been started over less. So this is an extremely dangerous bias. And it turns out that if you are bilingual, multilingual, you have a secret weapon against the framing effect. If you can think about the decision in your non-primary language, you can see right through the scam. So I speak a little bit of French. So if I try to make the beef decision in French, it would go something like, let's see, beef, that's boeuf, that's a lot of vowels. 95%, that's 89, no, 5, no. And by the time I've gone through all that processing, I could see right through the scam. Now, it turns out the framing effect can actually be used for good. There's an experiment where you have an audience and you show them a picture like this and you ask them, should this person drive this car? And what you basically get is a policy discussion, right? Some people are saying, old people are bad at everything. Don't let them drive. And other people are saying, how dare you? That's ageist. Let people do what they want. All you'll learn by the end of that conversation is who's on what side. Now, I can take the exact same photo, show it to another audience and ask, how might this person drive this car? And what you'll get is basically a design discussion. Some people will say, what if we change the shape of the steering wheel? What if we move the dashboard? And what you'll learn by the end of that conversation is several different ways that person might be able to drive that car. I only changed 2 words. By changing the frame of the conversation, I changed the whole conversation. In fact, what if I zoom out a little more and I ask, how might we do a better job of moving people around? Because that's why the guy was in the car in the first place. He was here, but he wanted to be there. And if I frame it this way, things like public transportation are on the table. Now, I want to close by talking about our biases, because these are the ones that can really get our users in trouble. Told you we come back to this. So for a long time, I had a misconception about what the scientific method was. I thought it was, I have an idea about how the world works. I'm going to test that idea. I'm going to write down what I did. If I get a good result, a whole bunch of other people are going to try the same thing. If they get the same result, great. That's a law. Write it down, check it off, move on. After talking to some actual scientists, I found out it's a little more complicated than that. So I have an idea about how the world works. I'm going to test that idea. If I get a good result, write down what I did. A whole bunch of other people try the same thing. If they get a good result, great. I get to spend the rest of forever trying to prove myself wrong. I have to ask myself, if I'm wrong, what else might be true? Okay, let me go and try and prove that. That is a much more rigorous approach and was created specifically to fight confirmation bias. Now, as designers, it is surprisingly easy for us to leave good design on the table because we fall in love with our first idea. Let me show you just how easy. Let's say we're going to play a game with the computer, and the computer is going to show us those numbers in a question mark and say, put whatever number you want where the question mark is. I'll tell you whether or not that number fits the pattern. Put in as many numbers as you like. When you think you know what the pattern is, tell me what you think the pattern is. If you're like me, the first number you try is 8. And the computer says, congratulations, that fits the pattern. Would you like to try another number? And if you're like me, you say, nah, I got this. The pattern is even numbers. And the computer says no. And the reason it says no is because I never tried this. The pattern is not even numbers. The pattern is simply every number is higher than the number that came before it, which is a much more elegant solution. Probably easier to code, probably cheaper to build, but I never got there because I was so in love with my even numbers idea. Now, there are ways to avoid this outcome. One of them is called red team, blue team. And the idea is you have a blue team who does the initial research. Maybe it gets as far as a wireframe. But before they go any further, the red team comes in for one day, and their job is to go to war with the blue team. They're there to find every hidden assumption, every more elegant solution, every potential cause of harm that the blue team missed because they were so in love with their first idea. And one of the things I like about this approach is that it's fairly cost effective. I don't have to go to my boss and say, hey, from now on, we got to hire 2 teams for every project and they got to check each other's work every single day. No, I need one team for one day to make it a little less likely that we're going to put something harmful out into the world. A great tool for this approach is called Speculative Design, and it's kind of like that show Black Mirror, which if you've never seen it, it's kind of a Twilight Zone for tech. You take some near future technology and you tell a story about what would happen if it got into the hands of real human beings, and the answer is always horrible. So that's kind of like what speculative design is, but it's frankly, I think anybody working on a new technology by law should have to write a Black Mirror episode about it first. But this is a real job. The team at Superflux went down to the United Arab Emirates to help them think about the future of energy. And the question on the table was, should we stay on the road of fossil fuels or should we start investing in renewables? And one of the things that the team at Superflux did was to say, okay, let's figure out what your air quality is going to be like if you stay on fossil fuels 5 years out, 10 years out, 15 years out. But they didn't just figure it out. They bottled it, and then they made them breathe it. And by the time you get to even 10 years out, it is unbreathable. At the end of that engagement, the UAE announced they're going to invest over $150 billion in renewables. Another great tool for this that you can, at the beginning of a project, use to really get all your biases out on the table is called an assumption audit. And the idea is you get your team in the room before you begin the project, and you ask these 5 questions. 1, what identities does your team represent? And you're really going to identify, self-identify as you feel comfortable, but you're going to be thinking about things like gender or age or income or neurodiversity. Then you're going to ask, how might those identities influence the design of this thing we're working on? Then you ask, what identities are not represented in your group, right? Who isn't in the room? Then you ask, how might the absence, right, of those perspectives potentially compromise the design of the thing you're working on? Finally, you ask, what might we do to include, honor, and give power to those voices in the design process? And I choose those words carefully. Include, yes, talk to people, honor, maybe pay them for their time, give power. Are there people who are going to be impacted by this work, who have no say in this work? And how do we give them more say because they have to live with what we make? Now, before, I showed you, this big metal chicken, and I asked you to think about, okay, well, why is there a big metal chicken there? And depending on your perspective, it may be actually kind of obvious. So the bloggess is a blogger, and in 2011, she did a post about buying her husband a big metal chicken for their 15th anniversary. I highly recommend you Google it. It's hilarious. My wife, when we were reading it at the time, was a big fan of the bloggess. We both were. And so when it came time for our 15th anniversary, yep, I got her a big metal chicken, and I'm in my backyard right now with our big metal 15-year chicken. Now, depending on your lived experience, if you in fact read the same blog post and like thousands of other people, know the story of the big metal chicken, this was absolutely obvious to you. You probably guessed it right away. If you didn't have that lived experience, this would be a mystery, right? So the point is, even in a hyper-specific example like this, your lived experience makes a huge difference in the perspectives you're bringing to a table. So value diverse experience, because hitting on that one person who's seen this blog post can sometimes be pretty hard. The final bias I'm going to talk about is called déformation professionnelle. Told you I speak French. And it's a bias where you see the whole world through the lens of your job, which in a workaholic society might seem like a good idea right up until it's not. The paparazzi who ran Princess Di off the road that night probably thought they were doing a good job. And technically speaking, they were. They were getting really difficult to get shots that were going to fetch them a really high price. What they weren't doing such a good job of was being human beings. Now, here in Philly, ways back, you had the former police commissioner of Philadelphia, a guy named Ramsey. And when he first took the job, he asked all of his officers the same question. What do you think your job is? And a lot of them would say to enforce the law. And he would say, okay, that sounds like a reasonable answer, but what if I told you that your job is to protect civil rights? Now that is a much bigger job. It encompasses enforcing the law, but it's a much bigger job because it forces you to treat people with dignity. Now, I've had this slide in here for a while, and every day it seems it gets harder to get through, but I keep it in here because now more than ever, it is clear that how we define our jobs is a matter of life and death. Now, Ramsey was telling his officers that day, okay, your jobs are harder than you think. And I'm here to tell us that our jobs are harder than we think. It isn't just design cool stuff. We have to find a way to define our jobs that allows us to be more human to each other. Now, there are folks working on this, right? You have Mike Montero out at Mule Design, creating a design ethics booklet that's kind of a first do no harm for designers. You have the Design Justice Network, which is doing amazing work in this area. And they have these 10 principles. I just want to read you the first two. We use design to sustain, heal, and empower our communities, as well as to seek liberation from exploitative and oppressive systems. 2, we center the voices who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. Now, if you just try to stick to those first two, you have got your work cut out for you. It's the difference between what Erica Hall calls user-centered design versus shareholder-centered design. We often think we're doing the former when we're kind of doing the latter. Another great tool for this is the Tarot Cards of Tech. It's this website you go to, and there are these cards, and you click on them, and they flip around and give you these really great prompts, provocative questions about the work you're doing. How might cultural habits change how your product is used, and how might your product change cultural habits? If Twitter had asked itself this before it launched, we might live in a very different world today. Even software engineers are getting in on this, right? You have the Never Again Pledge, which a bunch of software engineers and data scientists got together and signed when they saw that their work with data was being used to hurt immigrants. And they pointed to a very long history of data being used to hurt excluded populations and said, we don't want to be a part of that story. And here's a list of things we're going to do to make sure that doesn't happen, up to and including destroying unethical data sets. And we're seeing this kind of collective action even at places like Google, where there was Project Maven, which was a battlefield AI. And when the people working on it saw what it was, they said, look, we didn't get into this business to make weapons. If you make us work on this, we're gonna leave. And it worked. Google backed down. They walked away from a $250 million contract with the military. And then they turned right around and did Dragonfly, which is censored search in China, and this battle is still going on to this day. We must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Now, this is not some software guru giving a TED Talk. It's Martin Luther King, all right? Even 50 years ago, he saw this to be true, and it's only more true today. So the question I will leave all of us with is, how can we define our jobs in a way that allows us to be more human to each other? Thank you.